Well, thanks, Shell, for bringing us together as always, and giving us a space to talk through these issues. And yeah, Shell asked me to just give a little upfront perspective on how we're thinking about the business case for embodied carbon, and really this is about, for us, it's about scaling. It's like, how do we really bring in a broader audience? How are we really making a compelling case to do embodied carbon work specifically within the auspices of working on zero carbon buildings? For those that don't know International Living Future Institute or our programs or my work, I help direct the zero carbon certification, which is our standard that focuses explicitly on carbon, addressing both operational and embodied carbon. So this has been a really wonderful platform for us to engage teams on exploring deeply in embodied carbon and really making kind of a compelling case for why they want to have this verified and kind of celebrated in the market. So just in this last 2 years, I mean, this program's been out for 2 years, and I just kind of wanted to share some perspective on, what we're seeing as real leverage points that are helping make the business case and are really helping accelerate this work. And I think just at a broad level, we're really seeing that in order for these projects to really become realized, we need kind of a confluence of support in the public and private sectors. So, and it's actually extremely remarkable what has happened even just in the last year or two in both of these arenas. So I'll walk through these, but I really, I'm excited because we have, Rick and Monica to speak to these actually a little more in depth about why they matter. But we'll go ahead and kind of, I'll just give you a quick overview of what we're seeing, because the thing I think that's present for many of us personally, I mean, just being in Seattle, like we're very used to the scene of protests at this point, and certainly much of it is centered around Black Lives Matter and kind of the racial injustice that we're highlighting. But if we think back to even just a year ago, and certainly a year or two ago, many of those protests were actually related to climate and climate injustice. And, this has been kind of a moment that has really risen in the last year or two to hold our private sector, our public sector accountable for this and actually start to craft policy. And, we've actually, as of last year, we saw the first real movements in terms of building decarbonization. New York City's Climate Mobilization Act was really coming into force, and we saw new natural gas hookup bans happening in Berkeley and other cities that really exploded to over 30 cities in a very short period of time. And this isn't specifically embodied carbon related, but it actually set a precedent for embodied carbon policy because it started to create a new regulatory frameworks outside of energy code that we could start to actually address carbon specifically. And even towards the end of last year and into the beginning of this year, we're seeing the first embodied carbon specific policies come out. There's the Bay Area Low Carbon Concrete Codes project out of Marin County that came into effect in November. And then starting in January, we're seeing Buy Clean legislation come into force in California. Portland has deconstruction requirements that specifically are related to carbon reduction and materials. So, we're really at a moment where a lot of these policies are coming, are being developed and actually being implemented. And, I want to highlight for everyone here the fact that Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance, BioNova and Architecture 2030 put together this really fantastic research that laid out all these policy mechanisms that are available for embodied carbon for cities to use. And, in this moment where really the federal government has kind of abdicated leadership on climate action, it is the cities and states that are making these movements. So, this is a specific opportunity. Like this report and digging deeply in this report is a specific opportunity for the CLF community, and specifically CLF-Seattle, because like I know for sure that City of Seattle is looking into these and trying to consider what their roadmap is for introducing embodied carbon policy. So in terms of making, a kind of market-wide impact, that's going to start raising the bar and bringing embodied carbon into discussion of every project that's developed in the city. Our community, our CLF community chapter, supporting the evaluation of policies and actually going to advocate for them is going to be a huge thing we can do. So pivoting to the private sector, we've seen a lot of, the carbon disclosure or even kind of sustainability reporting related to carbon is nothing new. Many corporations, many city and state governments have been doing carbon disclosure project for years. And we've had other kind of proxies for carbon, like Dow Jones Sustainability Index, GRI and GRESB, that are all trying to kind of put together different ratings and priorities for action on sustainability and carbon. Unfortunately, they have been proxies. They have been approximations and not direct measurements of carbon, with the exception of Carbon Disclosure Project. And I think that's really the shift that's happening now in private sector, is that there's a renewed interest in actually having measurement of carbon impact in the actions that are taken by organizations. But the nice precedent that's been set up by these frameworks is that this has actually started to move investments towards companies that have taken a true leadership in climate action, or at least in green building, right? And I think, in terms of the pivot of when this becomes so much more direct is reflected in this letter that BlackRock, the world's largest investor, sent January of 2020. This just happened, stating that climate risk is an investment risk, and they were going to fundamentally reshape how they finance organizations within their portfolio that is focused on carbon reduction and climate action. So, the writing is on the wall, and there is so much renewed interest to actually go through the impact of organizations and try to measure their improvements so that they can respond to these sort of high-level requests from investors. And I think we've all seen this kind of watershed of major climate pledges that have been coming out. This one by Microsoft that happened again in January, so very recently, where they said they were going to go carbon negative by 2030. And, with that pledge, they started to state specific actions related to real estate that they were going to take. One of them being that their campus modernization project would be going for zero carbon, and they would be decarbonizing their entire new campus presence. So this is, you could see that we're now starting to create that very strong link between actions in real estate and what they're doing and these high-level carbon pledges. And the same thing with Amazon. They made the climate pledge in 2019 in September of last year, and now we're seeing, as of the last few weeks, they've announced that they're putting their name, climate pledge of their initiative, on Key Arena. And this is a major kind of a landmark project in their real estate portfolio that they are showing how they are decarbonizing. So, all this kind of investment pressure, pressure from competition is now being really articulated in specific actions. And I'm excited that you all get to hear from Monica from ULI, because they put out an absolutely fabulous report that is laying out both the public and the private sector market pressures or market leverage points that are helping real estate developers and investors really articulate why they need to do this. So, again, our role in this is we need to step forward as practitioners, particularly in the Seattle area, in this region, and help our companies that have climate pledges, carbon pledges, articulate the value of doing embodied carbon. That it really is directly linked to these commitments they've made, and it's one of the best ways they can measure it. So with that, I'll turn it over to Chell to move on to our next speaker. But let's keep that discussion alive of how CLF community here in Seattle can really support this.
So we're going to open up to any questions now for Andrew before we move on to Monica. Is there any questions anybody want to put in the chat? I had one, and that is, so how, so Andrew, how do you see investment pressure? I mean, that's obviously a huge pressure on those who finance buildings. But how does that affect the design and renovation of buildings? I mean, is there a direct relationship, or is there,
Well, I
because
think
it's not like you get a bill for your embodied carbon necessarily. I mean, you could in some frameworks, but you don't necessarily do that. So, how do you,
I mean
how do you
it's
see that happening?
yeah. I mean, and I think Rick can actually speak to really the deeper side of the financing related to this, because it you know it's both in articulating how decarbonization and the process of doing that is actually making a more valuable property. So really connecting carbon to dollars, stuff that like developers, investors already care about, and like drawing the straight line. But even if we as kind of practitioners don't have, the vocabulary to speak in financial terms, we can at least say, like, ask the question, how are you measuring your carbon commitments? And that's, I think, these organizations are searching for ways to really show what they're doing is making impact, that they're moving closer to their goals. So I think it's like taking that pressure and turning it into like an opportunity to bring value to your practice, your services, that you're actually helping them with this. It's not just an accounting exercise for their people that procure clean energy.
Yeah. Yeah. I like how it can translate directly into architecture and design and what we do every day. And it seems like in some ways, we have to help them understand how we can help them. And
Yeah.
in other times they come to us and say, how can you help us do this? And
It's interesting because I look at some of the firms that are involved with us, and they're already doing this stuff. They're already doing low embodied carbon design, but they're just not talking about it. And it's like you're giving up that value that your services provide in this initiative by not even talking about it. And I love the example of a colleague at Skanska. They went to my video froze. There we go. They went to a project interview and said, "Did you know that you have this incredibly high impact potential from the concrete that you're procuring for this project? And if you made a slight tweak to your specs, you could claim this extremely high level of carbon savings." And that's just like giving your client a gift of, here's good work you can claim if you can measure it.
yeah. So Jesse, Shayna asked a question as well, and Jesse asked the questions.
What's been the popularity? Well, the question is, what's the popularity of net zero certification programs? I mean, I can tell you just off the cuff, like, of all of our programs at ILFI, zero carbon is getting the most attention and inquiries. Registered square feet, we're already north of 10 million square feet in less than 2 years. So and what's really interesting is that we're working at an organizational level. So when we have these engagements, we're talking about how to decarbonize whole building portfolios and not just individual buildings. And I think that's actually what's different, because, when you're talking about embodied carbon, you're talking about supply chain. When you're talking about decarbonizing energy, you're talking about energy procurements across a portfolio, and you have much more impact potential.
Yeah. Jesse had a question. Specific individuals working in economics and finance who are researching the relationship between operational and embodied carbon over time. The value of carbon now versus carbon later from operations.
I mean, actually, Chell, I thought you were working on that.
Yes, I am. I'm working on, carbon in all its forms and how it relates to the built environment.
Yeah, I mean, time value is such an important issue in terms of like the design impacts that can reduce carbon now at construction versus the things operationally that will be reduced in the future. I've seen a number of firms, and actually I've seen structural engineers take the lead on this. Walter P. Moore is doing some great work. Dirk Kestner, who's very active in CLF, and PAE engineers. I mean, they're mechanical, but they've done some great work in kind of building these calculators that compare embodied operational, and even refrigerants,
Yep.
and how the carbon reductions work.